What we thought we'd talk about is three factors or three things that we think what your top three might be are factors that are obvious issues with complexity in workplaces today. So your top three factors that you would say, this is something that's needlessly complex. We've really got to do something about it. It's impacting a lot of workplaces in the modern era. And you've got your three, I've got my three, and like we've done before, let's just get straight into it. Let's let you go through your first one, I'll go through my first one, and we'll see if we align.
Okay, that sounds good to me, Nick. So I'm starting us off.
I think so.
All right.
Yeah.
My first one is communications, and it's a very broad one. And when I started thinking about this, I was reflecting. I've worked in a number of different industries, and I've seen communications work really well and really badly, and a lot in between. So, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But the first thing that came to mind is perhaps the sheer volume of communication. Like it can be, complex. Whether it's needlessly complex, I suppose, can be open for debate. But a classic example is probably the emails that we're CC'd into. Like so many of those emails and communications, and prioritizing them, for our own attention, but also, I guess, weighing down people with too much communication and not informing them. So, if you cutting people out of the loop, that can be a problem as well. And then we've also on this podcast, I guess, many times now talked about work-life balance in different ways and expectation around communications. That's a hard one. When how soon do you have to respond to something? How do you respond to it? What's the expectation? Even the fact, like, communication, technology is supposed to make it easier for us, but we often find ourselves now like emailing somebody who's like sitting maybe 10 meters away from us, and there might be a really good reason for doing that, because you might sort of need to have a bit of a paper trail, or you might need to have something to make it official, so to speak. But then, sometimes it's a barrier and actually prevents human communication as well. And I jotted down a few little aspects into my head. Another was just the sheer number of platforms. Like it can, so, we have email, obviously, but then more and more organizations are using platforms like Teams now. And Teams can be great. I don't use it a huge amount, but some people swear by it. Some people find it a bit of an imposition on them. So really just making sure we're all on the same page with communications, I suppose, can be a challenge in itself.
Yes. That's actually my number two. I had communication as well. That's the second one that popped into my mind.
Did you have a sort of a different take on it than I did, or you're thinking along similar lines?
Well, very similar. I had this experience back when I was doing a placement, like over 10 years ago, I think. And I was sitting next to the IT guy who answers all of the job requests.
Yeah.
So when people email the job request to him, he then has to get back to them, prioritize, and sort them out.
Yeah.
And because I was new and I was navigating my own IT issues, I would often sort of just turn to him and go, "Oh, how do I do this?" And, "Oh, this isn't working," or, "I can't access this."
I bet he loved that.
Well, at one point he actually turned around and said, "Oh, you're really just going to have to put a job request in."
Yeah.
And I just found it like fascinating. Here I am sitting right next to him. He can resolve it in literally 5 seconds.
Yeah.
But I have to go through this system.
Yeah.
I can understand why he does it. It's like, why should I get a priority over everyone just because I happen to be sitting next to him?
I had some kind of similar experiences. I'm pretty sure I've related this anecdote to you before. I'm not sure if I've done it on the podcast, but when I worked in politics, I went from being in opposition to then actually being in government. And when you're in opposition, you have very few resources, so you're just sort of getting by with what you have. And when you get into government, suddenly you just have endless resources, really, of the public service, and lots of people at your disposal for information and advice, and it's fantastic. But I had a situation one day where I was reading a brief for the minister, and I had to sort of clear that before I handed it up to him. And I saw a name on there of a contact officer, so an individual with a phone number who had written that brief, and I had a few questions about the brief. So I thought, well, this is pretty simple. I'll just pick up the phone and I'll call this guy and we'll have a chat and he'll answer my questions and that'll be fine. And I did that, and he seemed, fairly happy to talk to me, but he was a little bit guarded and there was some sort of reluctance in the conversation, but I didn't really pick up on it too much. And then a couple of hours later, the chief of staff called me into his office and said that I'd gone about that inquiry in the wrong way.
Mm.
So, but by the sort of the departmental procedure was, I was supposed to first of all go to a departmental liaison officer in writing, and then that person would contact actually yet another person before they'd contact the contact officer. So I took it quite literally, and I was used to sort of things happening very, very quickly, and I was told I'd gone about it the wrong way. And I remember the word process came up, that the way I wanted to do it wasn't the process, and I questioned that. So I found that a constant frustration when I worked in government, just those layers of process around communication.
Do you think that it was a genuine formal process, or it was a more almost like a workplace norm that you violated? So, in other words, everyone follows this process. We haven't ever documented it, but it's just the way we do things around here, and you've violated that norm, or a bit of both,
It's a
maybe.
bit of both, honestly. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of there for them to hide behind to some extent, and there's different layers of advice when you're in government. So you actually can get a thing called telephone advice. So you can call up and you're supposed to get something over the phone, and that's meant to be very transactional, simple sort of stuff. And then for something that's much more complex, you get what they call written advice, which is formal, and they'll have like a 2 week turnaround to get that for you. And then in the middle, there's sort of email advice. And I used to sort of constantly find it fascinating about what level of advice you needed for different things. I remember when I was finishing up, I wanted to task the department to give me email advice about email advice. So like to prepare a brief through email about when email advice was appropriate. But I was politely told by, again, my chief of staff that probably wouldn't be a good use of the department's time, but it would have been a delicious sort of Humphrey Appleby, yes, Prime Minister moment.
Yeah, that classic sort of, we need a procedure for all these procedures.
Yeah, that's literally what. In fact, the Department of Defence
Mm.
have a book that like it simply is an index of all their acronyms. So it's like a sort of
Oh,
a
yeah,
book that's
I
just a
remember
glossary. Yeah, yeah,
acronym. I remember it was like acronym busters and things like that. That you,
yeah, yeah. And people really do speak in acronyms there, and they don't. When I first moved into that world, I found it very off-putting, and I thought people kind of deliberately putting up walls. But it becomes a norm. Like people do think and speak in those terms. Yeah.
yeah. I to be honest, I found it off-putting as well. I felt maybe it's one of those things where you feel like you actually are in the out group. You're not part of the in
Mm.
group because you don't know the jargon. But sometimes it felt like it was a bit put on. Like, how many acronyms can I sort of say in one sentence? And
It often does. Yeah.
yeah, and it's a bit. It's always like sometimes some of the things that become acronyms sometimes didn't need to be as well. Like, I'm always fascinated when I used to mark assignments for at university, like lab reports and things. 'Cause in
Yeah.
science, they do it a lot as well. They create, you have like a construct or something, and then they come up with this term, and then they abbreviate it to like 4 letters or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but then they would do things like they would. There was one where we were doing a personality inventory, and instead of referring to like say extroversion, they would abbreviate it to E.
Oh yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
I've
so
seen
they
that.
would go through. So you'd be
Yeah.
reading this string of sentences with just letters, and I'd say, well,
Yeah.
first of all, you haven't saved on words because one letter is actually counted as a word anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a whole other thing that like there's the death of language. And I know we've talked about weasel words before, but there's also weasel acronyms. I didn't mean to do this, but I embarrassed a public servant once, like in a briefing by, I was very new to a subject area and an acronym was used. And I actually just asked straight out, can you tell me what that is? And they didn't know. And it was kind of like this loss of face for them. Like I felt really bad for them actually, and I didn't
Mm.
want to put them out there like that. But yeah,
Well,
it was fun.
that's pretty common actually because RACV and TAC in Victoria, most people can't off the top of their heads tell you what the TAC stands for because it's very rarely used. Do you know what it is?
The Transport Accident Commission.
Yeah, that's it. You've got
Okay. I was sort of half guessing, but yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
and at one point when I was working at Vic Roads, there was a change in government, and there was a mandate that came in that said no more acronyms in briefings, and it was partly because I think they were receiving all these briefings, had no idea what the acronyms meant, and so we had to start writing out in long form RACV and Transport Accident Commission and things like that.
Yeah, wow.
Things
How
we
long did that last for?
well, they were commonly known as acronyms
Yeah.
like TAC. Everyone in Victoria at least knew what that is.
But I know some organizations now or companies like almost formally change their name to become their acronym. Like I know, BP, that was British Petroleum
Yeah.
back in the day, but I think they've made, like, no one calls them British Petroleum anymore. It's almost like they purely identify as BP because they don't necessarily want to have the national logo.
Well, and interesting is you can hide an acronym as well because KFC, as in
That's another example. Yeah.
yeah, they were trying to hide the word fried because fat became a bad like fried food was considered junk food. So
I think it's embraced now. I don't think there's such a hang up over it anymore.
Well, that's exactly what's happening. They're reverting back to Kentucky Fried Chicken because sugar is now the enemy and fat is now back on the menu. So now, in terms of my first one, we'll jump onto that one.
Yes.
I had communication number 2, so I'll show you. My number 1 was somewhat related to what we were talking about. It was this is needless complexity. This was needless documentation, procedures, policies.
This is my number 2.
I had a feeling it would be. I mean,
yeah, this is very neat. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just out of control. It's something about. I was just thinking of to give a non sort of work related example. I guess it's work related, but if you took, for example, like somebody who's writing like a novel, and George R.R. Martin, who did Game of Thrones, is very well known for this. He writes very long books. And it got to the point with one of his books that he had to split it into 2 books.
Oh, I've read it. Yeah, that's the sort of the final book in the what he got up to with Game of Thrones. Essentially, they split it into 2 books. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and he what he ended up doing, interestingly, was instead of splitting it up into like this is the first part and this is the second part, like in a time frame, he broke it into locations. So
yes,
and characters. Yeah. So
character perspectives. Yeah.
Yeah. So you end up going back in time again from other characters.
Yeah.
Like the character who wasn't featured in the part 1 is now featured in part 2, but you haven't progressed the story. You actually have to go back in time.
Yeah.
And it was kind of not very popular because a lot of people felt like it kind of broke the flow of the story and
yeah, I found that like I liked some characters more than others, and I kind of felt like I had to slog through some narrations to get to the ones I liked. Like from memory, the first half of that book is harder going, and then I think in the second half you sort of get a bit further along. But yeah, it can be. It's not for everyone, definitely.
Correct, yeah. Well, and in workplaces, that's something that we do a lot of is simplification of procedures, and it's a real slog, like getting through like the I guess all the data that organizations generate in documentation, because there's no cap on it. You can always write new procedures and policies, and then usually you have to cross-reference them, and then the people writing them are not always people who are good wordsmiths. Sometimes they're very smart people who are technically smart, but they don't write succinctly. They write very long, verbose things, lots of technical information. And
I agree with that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and you end up you end up looking at some documents and you go, I can't believe how complicated they've made this one topic, and then you look at the reality around the workplace and you go, well, people actually aren't following that anyway. It's what is this document actually doing exactly? It's just sitting there.
Yeah.
Is anyone actually using it? Is anyone actually picking it up and reading it? Is it actually useful at all?
Yeah, I think that's very true.
So one of the psychological constructs, I guess you call it, or biases that is related to it is called the effort heuristic. And
Mm.
the idea is that the more effort you put into something, their bias is that it must be of higher quality because it's more deep.
Oh yeah, this is very interesting to me. Like I think I've talked about before. You know, like the idea of activity and outcome, like that. Just because you're like working like 60, 70 hours a week doesn't necessarily mean that you're producing
Correct.
anything particularly valuable. And yeah, again, I think my time in Parliament, I've certainly seen that happen. I'm not saying it's happening everywhere, and not the good work isn't getting done, but it can be. Like you can have a work culture, a work ethic where there's a huge amount of focus on activity, but there's not a lot of focus on what you're actually getting out of it, what you're producing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's there's obviously some relationship between effort and outcome because if
Mm.
you put any effort in, then you
Yeah,
get the outcome, right?
yeah,
But it's almost like it's the assumption that it's linear. That if we just keep adding more to it, then somehow the product will be better and better, or the service, or the process, whatever it might be.
yeah. I wonder. I don't know if you've studied, in your research why that is, but I wonder if it's because we link sort of physical exertion with outcome and achievement. So, like, we know that if we train hard, say we're training to run a marathon, for example, that if we keep up our training and we do all that, then we're going to perform better in the marathon probably. But then, when we're talking about a lot of the work we're doing, we're probably talking about a lot of
Mm.
thinking based work, and it's not necessarily the same thing.
Well, yeah, that's kind of the heart of that the project I mentioned before. So Project Simplify, and it's basically it's a very counterintuitive, but it's basically saying if you create more work and more information and more procedures, more policies, you're not necessarily creating a better quality workplace. You actually might just be really aggravating people and making things harder because it's so much to navigate, and you no longer have the headspace to think because you're constantly going through this bureaucracy of information.
Yeah, that's right. And depending on what the work is and what the project is, like we actually put a lot of distractions and barriers around the work itself. So if you need to sit down and write a report or put, some sort of methodology framework together or whatever it is, like at some point you're going to have to sit down for an uninterrupted amount of time and be able to do that. And process, procedure, communications, meetings. You could
Mhm.
almost list meetings as a whole
Yeah,
thing
oh,
by itself.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I've often made a sort of a half joking observation that, in meetings, we talk about the work we'd be doing if we weren't in the meeting. Like, meetings are obviously necessary things, but meetings can be wild beasts that get out of control. And I think we've all been to meetings where we're questioned that why the meeting is taking place, or sometimes meetings are called so people can kind of denote their own importance, or people, certain voices dominate the meetings, and yeah, meetings are necessary, obviously, but they can be an evil thing in a way.
yeah, I know. If you're going to strip away what, like the term meeting has all these sort of connotations now with it, but
Yeah,
if you strip away what it was really to do, is that you're coming together to solve a problem or to communicate something, and
yeah,
something along those lines, right? And it was not a formal thing where you had to actually go to a separate location and then organize it and then book out a room and do all of these things.
yeah.
But these workplaces today are certainly adding. I reckon that's a great one, actually. In fact, I think I'd like to do that to be my number three. Now I think about it,
Yeah.
meetings.
Yeah, and meeting's something we definitely unpack. Do you think there's, in some ways, I feel there's more me like last year when we sort of transitioned into the work from home thing, at the very beginning, at least some projects I was working on, I felt that everyone felt they needed to have lots of little meetings all the time, that there was this almost this fear that we were going to somehow lose touch with each other, and it just like letting everyone go for a couple of days and then checking back in was just a bit too scary. So I was on one project where we were doing like twice a day these check-in meetings, and they were really interrupting the workflow from my perspective. So yeah, have you found similar things? Or
Yeah, well, actually, so when the same similar thing happened to us when we went remote, we started setting up this just like I think it's about a 30-minute catch up in the morning. At first thing, not at the end of the day, just and yeah, at one point I was like, I was thinking, I wonder if we really need to catch up every day. But I got a lot of feedback, at least from my team, saying that because we never did that before, we always just met when we needed to.
Yeah.
Because it's a very small team. But quite a few people were saying that how much they preferred just having just a really quick catch up, just so they could tell people what they're up to and also just flag things with people for the day because they wouldn't see them in the office, and it was
Yeah.
also a way of just staying connected. But then we came up with this other idea, which was to run the early morning session, but then everyone every day would come up with like a little activity that would be like a bit of a something that would get people thinking, and it
Mm.
was like a bit of development time. Uh,
Yeah.
but then that sort of turned into turned into its own beast, and what we ended up happening was the sessions would run for 45 minutes to an hour, and then people would do bits.
That's the problem to me there. Like, so if it's, I do a similar thing at the moment where I'm running a team meeting pretty much every morning for, it's really meant to be 15 minutes. It usually turns into 30. And if it's 30, that's okay. But then if it starts creeping up beyond that, it becomes complicated, I find. So
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're bang on that the meetings situation is definitely getting out of hand. It's been out of hand for a long time, and I think it's the setting in anything that you have to set up a regular catch up, a regular meeting. I think if you're going to do that, that's fine. But I think the idea is that you should be flexible enough to be able to go. We don't need to catch up,
Yeah.
and then move on. But having a placeholder there for consistency could be useful. But only to be used if necessary. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. A lot of that's trusting your people as well and your team. And I think in a way it's kind of probably shown, well, some strengths and weaknesses in different teams and organizations. So some that are very rigid and sort of, need to have everybody there. It's almost like they don't trust them not to be like,
Yes.
laying on their couch watching Netflix all day. Like that sort of stuff got shown up pretty quickly. But I'm very outcomes focused. So for me,
Mm.
I'm fairly relaxed about how people get there.
Yeah, me too. I agree with that. It's the trust that you've got good people, and if you've hired good people, you're working with good people. You just leave them alone, let them get there however they need to, and
Yeah.
they'll escalate things if needed. But yeah, I think that other managers throughout different organisations sometimes inherit teams who they don't completely trust, or there might be individuals within the team that they don't trust, and so
Mm.
that they're in a difficult space sometimes. And I've spoken to some of them in the past where they've said, "Look, I'm not getting the outputs that we used to get, or that
Yeah. Okay.
it's a bit
Yeah.
disengaged, and it hasn't actually been that helpful. Just letting your hands off the reins completely."
Yeah.
But I think it just comes down to situation and like who the person is and how much autonomy that person likes. Because there are some people who also they actually like a bit of structure as well.
Yeah.
Like people like you and I perhaps would be like, no, we like the flexibility. We like to just work to our own pace. And if we're really passionate about something, really into it, we'll work longer and harder. But if we're finding that we can't get through an obstacle, then we think, oh, I'll put this off for 24 hours until I can work on it. And
Yeah.
whereas other people might like to have the accountability to have someone, calling
Yeah,
them up.
that's a really good point. And there's nothing wrong with that either. It's just different working styles. And I think that's something I tried to work on myself in recent times. Like if someone's coming into the team, pay attention to where they've come from before, what they're used to. And if they do need more structure, probably give it to them to the extent that you can, or at least kind of like shepherd them through a bit into your own workplace culture.
Was that your third one or not? Or did you have another one?
I kind of have another one. It was often with my third one. I sort of haven't encapsulated it as nicely as I'd like to, but it's around, I guess, evaluation. So like how we, like we have KPIs and things like that, but just like the process we have for like
Performance
knowing,
management.
knowing if we've done a good job. Like, so again, it's looking at the outcomes, but um, and even tied up in that, I had this concept, which is actually this military idea of like mission creep, which means like you start a mission with one objective, but then in the middle of the mission, for various reasons, you might lose sight of that objective and actually end up gravitating towards a completely different objective for various reasons. Like the first one might become unobtainable, or your just political imperative might change. But often I find the processes around evaluating our outcomes can be quite complicated, like for various reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I definitely think performance management, like setting the performance goals and then reevaluating them and all of those things, that actually has become the way it's done. I think it has become very bureaucratic. It's very much about filling out forms and getting managers to tick off that you're doing your job. In the past, I've found people quite often will set performance goals they know they'll easily be able to achieve as well.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
It's like they know they don't want to be sitting down in 12 months having to discuss why they weren't able to achieve something.
yeah, yeah.
Or
There's a
they,
politics around that. Yeah,
yeah, well, the opposite, of course, is that sometimes people will set goals that are just insanely ridiculous. Like they're so ambitious and there's so many of them that they really underestimate just how hard it will be to actually meet those goals.
yeah. I've been in situations where I've got very high goals. KPIs have been set, and then I've been told privately, "Well, it doesn't really matter if you don't meet them." And I'm
Mm.
sort of like, I don't understand why we don't align it with something that we actually expect to meet.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah. Well, I think I've never really been super motivated when setting formal performance management goals, but I think that there's an art to it as well. Like there are certain strategies that make them more meaningful.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
yeah, and this project, Project Simplify, was actually one of the reasons why we've connected it with mental health. Is that a lot of the stuff we're talking about is kind of like meaningless, not meaningless, but like they can be meaningless activities if you don't do them properly, or we create unnecessary busy work or complexity, which is actually not meaningful to us. So if we feel
yeah,
like we're filling out forms or reading documents we're just doing it because we have to, because the organization has become complicated and we have to read this policy or we have to attend some superficial training on some topic that you'd have no interest in, then
yes.
you no longer have really the headspace for more creativity. You perhaps feel a bit cynical about the work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen. I
Mm.
mean, we've all probably had to do those online training modules at different points in our career, and I think we've all gotten pretty cynical. I have about that anyway, because it feels like a box ticking exercise. Because like by making it that sort of self guided online training module, they're kind of like dumbing it down in a way as much as they can, but it can still take up half your day sometimes to do some of these modules. So
Yeah,
you think if they really valued it, they'd probably run a workshop or something, right? Or actually have some
mm.
interaction. But otherwise, they're just like making you go through.
I think it depends on the topic, because I think if you know for a fact that the way it reads is that we're doing this because there's some sort of compliance objective where they
Yeah,
need to
yeah,
get a tick, you don't have to have someone tell you that that's the case, and therefore you're immediately on guard because you're thinking, well, this is not a meaningful activity for me, and this clearly the content and the approach is not going to be tailored to be interesting.
yeah. Mm.
And it may not be, and if it's a topic that you've got no interest in learning about as well, and it's not going to be beneficial to your job really, then like it could be something around conflict of interest training or something,
Yeah,
and that could come about because there might have been someone in the organization who, let's say, they gave their mate some work and they 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 gave them a contract or something, and they didn't disclose that they were best friends or they went to school together or that it was their cousin. There could be.
yeah. No, no. I mean, that's a good point. And yeah, I mean, there's not another thing too. I suppose is a lot of boring stuff is important as well. Like so, sort of compliance and risk management and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like it might be pretty dry. Yeah. But we're going to do it. We're going to do a whole podcast on risk management one day and use George Costanza as our
Actually,
inspiration.
actually, I'm one of those people. I actually don't. I actually like risk management, as in
Yeah,
like the topic around risk. I think is interesting
I do too. Actually, yeah, yeah,
because it's basically your life is all about risk.
yeah,
But I agree that the approach to managing it and dealing with it is usually quite mundane and boring. And
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's true. But
yeah,
it's, I mean, not everything can be interesting all the time, and there are. I mean, it's great to be challenged and be creative, and I thrive on all that sort of stuff too. But there is admin, and there's even emails that have to be responded to, forms that have to be filled out, like things have to be done. But it's just a question of balance, I suppose. And Yeah, I'm noticing with a lot of projects, like, compliance is a important imperative, but it's adding layers of complexity on. It flows down, so you can sort of, particularly like if you're partnering up with government, there's a lot of emphasis on compliance, and there should be. You're ultimately, if you've got a grant, that's taxpayers' money, and I'm paying that tax, so are you. We all are, so we want to know that money's being, accounted for in the correct way. But it really cascades downwards. So you're sort of stressed out about it, and then the chances are you're probably passing that on to somebody else too.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's the issue is that well, I guess what you're referring to is kind of like your job demands,
Mm.
and if you're investing, like one of the questions that came up when we were working on this project was, is complexity really that stressful? Isn't there an element of complexity which is actually motivating, and it actually makes our jobs interesting, and we've got problems to solve, we've got real challenges as well. So
Yeah,
complexity is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's unnecessary complexity we're talking about.
yeah, yeah.
And
I
it's
agree.
kind of like the idea that when you have to go through like a series, let's say you have to go to local council to get a permit to build your house.
Yeah.
That's not something that people would necessarily want to do. If like that's something that's a necessary evil in order to do the more fun thing, which is build
Yeah,
the house.
yeah, yeah.
And then
Neighbors probably want you to do it. 'Cause you're going to build like that third story to block out the sun or something.
yeah, indeed, and there's and because we're doing a renovation at the moment, I've certainly like there's been steps in the process which I've kind of found aggravating, but then there's been other ones which have held things up where I thought I get why there's a hold up because it was
Yeah,
really important. Like it was something to do with like the structural engineer may have raised an issue that was potentially the house could fall down if you don't address it.
yeah. No, that's a good thing. Yeah,
Oh, that's the situation we want to. We certainly so the necessary complexity there might just simply be when we say complexity, it's just a bit of extra paperwork and time, and perhaps even a bit of conflict between different stakeholders and parties to resolve an issue.
yeah,
That's all fine, I think, if everyone's working towards a solution and it's a necessary evil to work through a complex problem. Uh,
yeah,
but if it's something like we need to get this other stakeholder to go in and do some sort of assessment that we don't think is actually adding any value, and it's going to hold things up for 2 weeks, and the person we're trying to get in contact with doesn't communicate very well, and all of those things add up, and people walk away feeling frustrated and irritated, and increases conflict, and that's kind of one of the things we're looking at as part of this project. Is do these factors related to complexity actually lead to issues with mental health? And our initial findings on it anyway was quite interesting because we actually did find there is a relationship between complexity and well-being,
yeah,
and also productivity, of course. So really high complexity in organizations, at least preliminarily, is that a word? Preliminary? Yeah.
yes, that's a word.
That's just the way I said it. It suggests that, there's a reduction in well-being and productivity when complexity increases. Uh,
Yeah,
but it'll be interesting at the end of the project to see whether or not there's a level of complexity which might be good for your well-being, like where
yeah.
it might be a challenge.
Like a sweet spot, so to speak. Like you're getting like
Yeah,
a balance. Yeah, that would be interesting. I'd like to see that.
yeah. Well, I've got a sneaking suspicion that human beings, if their life is simple, will find ways to complicate them.
I'm sure that's true. Yeah,
There is because there surely is. I just think out of boredom or just something, people go always seem to find a way to add some unnecessary issues in their life, myself included. Occasionally, you think to
yeah.
yourself, "Why did I go about this way? This clearly would it was not the best way to go about it." But somehow I found myself in this situation.
That's a really good point. Like I think we all say, and I include myself in this, that we want simplicity and no drama and
Mm.
things like that. But we probably all to varying degrees undermine that constantly. What we actually do or choose to do. Yeah.
Well, it's in everything, art and movies and books and things. We don't read about the simple story. We love to watch a film or something where someone's life gets into disarray. They get thrown into an adventure and they're caught up in something really difficult. We don't sit there and watch shows where everything kind of just works out for the person and it's just pretty normal. They have breakfast, they go to work, and they come home. Although this is it's sounding a bit like that Seinfeld episode where the show's about nothing.
Yeah.
George wants to see a show on TV where basically the person just gets up and goes to work, and that's the show.
In its purest form. Yeah, just
Yeah.
following somebody around, like literally doing nothing. Yeah.
Yes, which of course is the inspiration for this podcast. Which
Yeah, absolutely.
it's never about nothing, of course. I don't know if any of those dedicated listeners has realised that it's always about something. This podcast, and it's kind of like an ironic name for it, I think.
Indeed.
But it's not quite. It's not quite about something consistently. Anyway, we don't just talk about the one topic. We seem to talk about everything. But I suppose every podcast is guilty of that to some extent.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Cam, for joining me. I actually didn't add my third one, but the reason for that was that I actually liked a couple of the other ones you brought up. And the meetings is definitely one of them, and the performance management. I think that trumps my third one. I won't go into it in detail, but my third one was, I think, unnecessary consultation and invitations to get involved in projects was one of them.
Oh, that's an interesting one in a way, though, like, because we could probably have a whole other discussion about consultation and the sincerity of consultation. Like, there's a lot of consultation that goes on, and they don't really want to know.
Yes.
Well, they might, they're just going to take whatever a community group or individual says and file it, basically, but they have to go through the process of consultation. And I find that one interesting. But
yes, yeah, indeed. Well, there you go. Well, it's you found it interesting, and we chose not to talk about it, which is annoying for them.
No, but this is one thing in the podcast too. We often find these little potential spin-off topics, so that could be one for another day.
All right. Well, I'll consult with you before the next podcast,
and then promptly ignore it. Yeah.
Yes.
Of course.
All right. Thanks, Cam. We'll catch up next time.
Look forward to it.